Today's episode features Lilianne Lugo Herrera, a colleague of mine at Muhlenberg College who is a professor of Spanish in the Language, Literatures, and Cultures department. Her work is particularly interested in Afro-Caribbean religious traditions like Ochun and Santeria. Though the details of this belief and practice are not particularly well known in public discourse about religion, they are becoming more prominent due to changing demographic patterns and the way that information spreads in our world. So, for example, you might be familiar with Santeria from a Supreme Court case that was in Hialeah, Florida. Likewise, you might be familiar with the confluence or the syncretism of Ochun and the Virgin Mary in veneration and practice of South Florida communities. The Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding, which produces this podcast, has two main goals or two main objectives in its mission statement, one of which is very often the subject of this podcast. That is that we are interested in enhancing the conversation on religion and how we think about religion in public life. The other objective for the Institute is about enhancing religious literacy. I think this conversation today does both of those things simultaneously. There is a need, particularly as these traditions become more prominent. People might see about them in media outlets, in popular culture, in their own neighborhoods as diaspora Caribbean populations become larger and larger. I think it becomes increasingly important to understand the belief and practice of these communities that have not, at least traditionally, been as well represented in our world. We're really lucky to have somebody like Dr. Lugo Herrera with us here at Muhlenberg to help translate these traditions, to expose our students to a really rich and complicated and long historical progression of how these religions developed from Africa across the Middle Passage on slave ships to the Caribbean, and then became syncretized and blended with Catholic traditions to give us the beliefs and practices that we can see today. The other portion of Dr. Lugo Herrera's work that we should pay attention to is that she is also interested in how these things are translated in literature and in particular in the theater. So in addition to her work as a teacher and a scholar, she also is active in the theater, having written, produced, directed plays that focus on or center these religious traditions, of highlighting the stories from these traditions. So I hope you can tell that I was really excited to have this conversation, to learn more about these traditions, to learn more about her interest in them and how she came to study this material and to bring it to us here. So without further ado, here's our conversation. Lilianne Lugo Herrera, thanks for coming on ReligionWise.
Thanks for having me.
So I did a little introduction in the beginning that our listeners will have heard, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself a little bit more in a second. But I want to start off with just getting a taste of what we're going to talk about, a taste of the subject matter, and get you to talk about that. And then we'll go back and do a little bit of the biography. So there are a lot of layers to the conversation we're going to have. So I want to sort of start generally, and then we can drill down. So you describe the religious communities that you're interested in as Afro-Caribbean, but I know that that is a potentially contested category as well. On the surface, that designation seems fairly self-explanatory, but the more you look at it, the more complicated it gets. Can you talk about that term, how it's useful, how it's not useful, how you use it in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So the term, I use it mostly because the work that I do is focused on the Caribbean and its diasporas broadly. But the other scholars prefer to use the term, for instance, like use the Black Atlantic or Afro-Atlantic religions, since they involve countries that are in the Americas, say Brazil or Guyana, any other country that have also this influence from slaves that came to the Americas during the slave trade, and they develop a new set of religions, oftentimes syncretized with Catholic rites or with Catholic saints. And we have this a sort of Afro diasporic religions all throughout the Americas. But now also we live in a globalized world, where we have practitioners of Santeria, for instance, and they may live in Japan or anywhere else in the world. So we can also talk about Afro diasporic religions in a wider sense, or transnational religions even. But I still use Afro-Caribbean to make this distinction of the African origin and the traditions that these religions still have their connections to Africa, but also to base the geographic region that I'm mostly interested in, so the Caribbean and its closest diasporas.
So I want to chase down a couple of those strands in a minute and talk about them. But before we get there, I'm going to give you your opportunity to do your biography. How did you come to be interested in these materials? How does your training inform the way that you study these materials? I always think that people like us, like college professors, we have an arc, we have an origin story. We come at these things not always so innocently, but through a complicated history. Can you tell us a little bit about the arc that led you to where you are today?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was born in Cuba. I came to the US not that long ago, 10 years ago. And I did my bachelor. I did a BFA in theater in Havana, but I was born in Santa Clara, which is a city in the middle of the country. When I was growing up, Cuba, to practice a religion in Cuba was not as something that was accepted. So I grew up in a house where there was no religious affiliation whatsoever. And even if my parents had been baptized as Catholics, we didn't practice Catholicism at all. I remember that the first time that we celebrated Christmas was after 1998, when Pope John Paul II visited Cuba, and it was the first time that Christmas was allowed, and suddenly it was considered even a holiday, but we didn't celebrate it as a religious festivity. We just cut a branch of a pine tree and we decorated with some paper ornaments, and that was it. So I didn't grow up with any sort of religious background. But then I got fascinated by an artist. Her name is Belkis Ayon. She's a Black Cuban printmaker. She died in 1999. She was very young, 32 years. And her work depicted a world that for me was fascinating, but I hadn't heard about it before. And it was the Abaqua world. So the Sociedad Secreta Abaqua, the religious, the secret society Abaqua, it's kind of a Freemasonry society, all male, it's secret, no women can be initiated in the society. And then you have this artist that is trying to create a visual representation for a world that doesn't have one, but from the point of view of an outsider. So she read a lot, this artist Belkis Ayon, she read a lot about the society and the literature that existed at the time, and she created these powerful images where she centered a character named Sikaan, which in the myth is the person who actually founds the secret. It was a fish. She was fishing in a river, and accidentally she catches this fish called Tanse, that is the representation or the incarnation of Abasi, the god. And the fish speaks to her, and he gives her the secret. And suddenly this tribe to which Sikan belongs to, they become more powerful because they have the secret, and they don't want the secret to be disseminated. But according to some versions of the myth, she betrays the secret because she tells the story to her husband when she's married, and she's sacrificed. Her skin is used to make a drum, but the drum doesn't work. They're trying to imitate to make the drum resonate with the voice of the secret of Tanse. She's sacrificed in vain in the myth. They eventually manage to make the drum sound with the skin of a goat, and that's how drums work, right? With in this many of these religions. But Belkis Ayon was interested in all of this and the position of this founding character of the Abaquas, Sikan, that never had any sort of representation, and women are not allowed in society, in this secret society. So for me, that world that she created was fascinating. I started through a wormhole to read all about it. And also at the time I was in the university, I had a relationship with someone that was that came to be initiated in Santeria, so I had the opportunity to experience firsthand what the religion was, and to learn so much of it that I became passionate about it. But it was always from a point of view of the relationship of the arts with these representations, because I was studying theater and I was writing a play about Berquisayon. So I was always interested in seeing that relationship, that tension between how something exists in the world and is practiced by many, many people, but also how that it's brought to the stage and has a second life in a way. And that's what I've been doing for some time. I've been doing other things too, but I've been continuing to look at many works that incorporate religious Afro-religious practices in theater mainly.
So I want to sort of drill down, and I'm not sure if this is a personal biography question or if this is sort of a broader cultural question, but your story about, these some of your first interactions with, Christianity of any kind are through the visit of Pope John Paul and then the celebration of Christmas. And then on the heels of that sort of exposure to this esoteric, right, secret society. And you don't have to follow this one down, but I'm thinking about, right, whether you are able to, in your, developing mind about these ideas, rather able to distinguish between sort of a mainstream religious practice and that thing that is esoteric. So on the one hand, that's an interesting dichotomy to me. On the other hand, sort of the thing that I want us to think about is all of these strands that are coming together that you mentioned. So there's the Catholic strand, there's the indigenous African strand that comes by way of the slave trade. I'm not sure if there are indigenous Cuban strand that comes together. So can you talk about the sort of the collision of those thought worlds, whether it be personally, right, or sort of more generically for this Cuban Afro-religious practice?
Yeah, it's so complicated because when I think about specific deities, and I'm going to put an example with the Virgin of Charity or Ochun. This is a saint that it has churches built around her, right? And it has a representation that pretty much ties with any other Catholic version of the Virgin Mary. But then for Cubans, when we see the Virgin of Charity, many of us, we also see Ochun, which is a goddess from the Yoruba tradition. And according to Antonio Benitez Rojo, which was a great scholar of Caribbean studies, he mentioned that in the cult to that Virgin of Charity deity, there's also some elements, especially in the beginning, of some indigenous Taino deities called Onahu. So we definitely have those different trends coming together, and today I think it's hard to separate them in the way that someone that has been raised as Catholic all their life could, because the slaves were in the end of 18th and 19th century. As they couldn't practice their religions, they started to look for elements in Catholicism that would allow them to venerate their own gods and goddesses through different images. So Ochun is usually depicted as having yellow clothes, and it's very maternal. So we have this virgin that is also dressed in yellow clothes. So, well, maybe they're the same thing. So for someone that grew up being just Catholic, maybe they do not see that other elements of the religion. But certainly today in Cuba, for the last 20 years, I would say there is much more people practicing Afro, Santeria.
So as I think our listeners will recognize, that there's a lot of diversity in the belief and practice around this category, Afro-Caribbean. And we've heard already, you mentioning Santeria and Ochun and I'm going to pronounce this wrong, Yoruba, right? That's a part of this world. So one, what is the relationship between these things? If we go to Cuba, for example, that we can imagine that we would see various strands or various syncretisms where these things are mixed together in different ways. So is this one thing or is this many things? How do you as a scholar think about it? And how do people who practice these traditions think about that diversity in their own, in their own neighborhood, in their own context?
Yeah, it really depends on how on what kind of beliefs everyone has, right? If someone grew up being strict Catholic, then someone might go to a church and just see the depictions of specific saints in the walls, and they would, I don't know, light a candle as a way of offering. But there might be people that practice the religion even if they are not completely initiated. So we call the initiated santeros. They have made OSHA, but some other people might have an inclination, might have faith in those saints and those in that religion, even if they are not completely initiated. So those people that have faith in, say, Ochun, Shango, all of these different deities in the Yoruba and Yoruba pantheon, they might go to the church and give offerings that are not necessarily just a candle. They might bring, say, a specific flower that Oshun likes. In this case, are sunflower. That's the flower that she prefers. They might, in their homes, for instance, using the depiction of the Virgin of Charity, they might have some kind of offering, like sweets, for instance. She very much like any kind of dessert, anything sweet, honey, etc. So they might use the Catholic representation to give an offering to Ochun. So someone visiting the island, for instance, might see people that are initiated, that are santeros. They are completely dressed in white in their first year of their religion, and they go to the Catholic Church. That's one of the steps that they complete in their initiation. So there is so much that is intertwined in these two religions that it's very hard to say, okay, well, this is pure Catholicism or this is just pure Santeria, because they are very much ingrained.
Okay, so I'm sort of playing this out in my head, right? If I am that traveler and I go to Havana, I'm thinking about worship space. So when you say church, like I could go to a Catholic church in Havana, and in front of the depiction of the Virgin Mary, I might see lit candles. That doesn't surprise me, but I might also see sweets, right, in that Catholic church.
So it really depends on the churches. Sometimes the priest in the churches won't like to see like food in the church, but you will see definitely the flowers.
Okay, definitely
instance,
the flowers.
The sunflowers.
And so any space that is, and I know I'm trying to sort of draw too hard boundaries here, but if we were to imagine worship space that is, to Ochun, that would be domestic space. Right? We have this confluence, happening in the church, but there might be domestic space that is more clearly delineated as being a part of these Afro-Caribbean practice?
Yes. Okay. So usually the santeros, they would have received Ochun as in a material form. It's what we call a sopera, like a soup bowl. It has a lid because these saints, their representations are mostly stones. But these stones cannot be seen by anyone else. So they need to be covered, and it depending on, some people have like altars with many like flowers, and sometimes artificial or sometimes natural. They usually put sweets and other things, even like curtains of the color of the saint, etc. But there's definitely an altar where people keep their saints, those that they received during the initiation process, at home. And most of the time, when they have their saint birthday, on the day that they made saint, they will do like a great party, inviting their religious community and friends to partake on the celebration. And you would have great amounts of food adorning the altar, music, and definitely some other religious practices. Yeah.
So to be clear, there's no, if you landed in Havana and said, "Hey, take me to, the Church of Ochun," right? Or take me to the worship place of Santeria. That is not, there's not ever like a public representation of that, right? It would be domestic or it would be private. The things that are public are more resonating with that sort of Catholic, more official religious identity. Is that right?
So it really depends because, for instance, the main sanctuary for Ochun, or the Virgin of Charity, in Cuba is going to be in Oriente, in Santiago de Cuba. It's in the eastern part of the country, and I haven't been there in a while, but they have like a second floor where they have all sorts of gifts that people have brought to the Virgin of Charity. I believe that there is even the Nobel Prize that Hemingway won. He donated to Cuba, and I think it's there, but don't quote me on that. I know there are many prizes and pictures and many gifts, and in many of those instances, it's blurry, right? It's blurry. What kind of gifts are for the Catholic Virgin of Charity or for Ochun, you know what I mean? In Havana, there's the sanctuary of the Virgen de Regla, and that Virgin is syncretized with Yemaya or Yemoya. This is the goddess of the sea, and this church is in the Bay of Havana, and you will see there outside of the church many people like fulfilling promises that they have made to the saint. There's also the sanctuary of Saint Lazarus was syncretized with Babaluaye, and you would see as well people fulfilling their promises to the saint on the streets, and maybe some santeros around the area, or so there's definitely in some spaces you will see that interaction, but in terms of the offerings, sometimes, as I said, like the priests and the people working in the church would be more hesitant to allow for specific offerings.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I'm chasing this down, the reason I'm so interested in this is because it seems like there is a dichotomy going on here between public and private, between official and unofficial, between, I would guess even that there's some gender distinction here, hierarchy, marginality, right, going on here, so that the sort of the Catholic hierarchical male empowered, right, sort of sits on one side of this dichotomy, whereas the more informal or more, I mean, again, private and traditional is happening on the other side. Is that a decent read?
Yes, absolutely. And I mean, in the relationship of any religion in Cuba with public space is complicated as well because the government itself did not allow for, I mean, to practice any religion was sort of being a counter-revolutionary. So many people that would openly practice any sort of religion would be expelled from the universities, or they would lose their jobs, etc. So it wasn't until the late 90s that this was actually a practice that you could conduct in public. So even if people were initiated in any of Afro-Cuban religion, they wouldn't be able to dress in public and in white, for instance, like initiated in Santeria, they dress in white for a whole year. So they couldn't do that because then everybody would notice that they're practicing this religion. But in the last 2 decades or so, there's been much more presence of religion in the street because there has been more it's actually been possible to do that. So and also in terms of gender, there's certainly many tensions in there. Some of these religions, like the one that I was mentioning before, the Sociedad Secreta Abacua, the Secret Society of Abacua, this is an all male society. And some other, for instance, in Cuba, the Regla de Ifa, to be initiated at a higher level than that would be to be a babalao, who's someone that can make divination, can be a priest for this religion. Women cannot be initiated in Ifa. But Santeria, for instance, is much more, Regla de Ocho or Santeria is much more permissible. So both women and men can be initiated. So there's also tensions inside each of the religions regarding gender.
So I want to zoom out a little bit, right? I really enjoyed this conversation on Cuban practice, but when we zoom out a little bit and think about the Caribbean generally, obviously there's a really complicated colonial past there that is Spanish and Portuguese and French. And I want to get in a little bit to like how we study these things, how we make categories and we think, because oftentimes that colonial past can affect who's interested and for what reason. So, for example, in Haiti, people who study French and Francophone diaspora cultures would be more interested there. Whereas, of course, in Cuba, the Spanish legacy is of course big. So, can you talk a little bit about how the category of Afro-Caribbean plays with those linguistic and the distinctions made in the colonial past, and then how that affects going to school to study these things, and do we end up with silos, right, because of the differences in linguistic tradition?
Absolutely, yeah. It's a question of access too, because there's definitely the need in order to study something fully. Most of the time, we need to understand the language in which these practices are performed. They exist in the world, and so I think that now more and more people are even producing scholarship in English here in the US. And I can mention a couple of examples. But for a while, most of the studies existed only in the language of each specific area. Say in Cuba, most of the scholarship around Afro-Cuban religions was produced in Spanish. Um, um, the most important scholar in that area, Lidia Cabrera, she came to the U.S. Exiled in the 60s, and she donated all her papers to, for instance, the University of Miami, the Cuban Heritage Collection. They have their collection there. And now her work has been translated into English. Her seminal work, El Monte, it's now fully available in English, but for many years it wasn't available. So there's definitely that lack. So people that wanted to study, they needed to travel to Cuba and talk to the people there in Spanish as well. In terms of disciplinary divisions here in the US, I learned French, for instance, but I did not learn Creole. So that it's definitely something that has limited my own understanding of Voodoo. I haven't been to Haiti to study Voodoo. So I am much more versed in the Hispanic area than in the French Caribbean, for instance. Yeah, but again, there are some scholars that are attempting to look transdisciplinary and across languages to these practices. Also, in Brazil, we have Portuguese. So there's definitely a crossings of different languages that hopefully will be more accessible.
Another one of those kind of 20,000 foot questions is, thinking about the African of the Afro Caribbean. I mean, I'm no student of the Caribbean, but even from an outsider's perspective, looking, watching the newsreels and thinking about cultural productions and so forth, that the ideas about race and ethnicity just seem, those categories are defined really differently than we encounter those categories, in the States. Can you talk a little bit about that? And is that so even hearing you talk about, practices in Cuba, like if you look at a snapshot of a neighborhood in Cuba, like skin tone, for example, there's a great diversity. Can you help us understand the way that about ethnicity and race are imagined? I mean, you can take Cuba as an example and how that might be defined really differently than what we might be used to in the United States.
Yeah, it's a huge difference. In Cuba, race is defined mostly by appearance. So people that look white, they would be defined as white, even if their grandparents were black, because it's very much about physical traits, hair, eyes, skin tone, and there is such a huge gradation of blackness in the Cuban society, and to be mulatto or mixed race, it's something that most people in Cuba are, right? There's so much so much diversity on that mixture of the white and the black. That, and I don't see that here in the U.S. And also here in the U.S. there's this difference of ethnicity and language. I'm a white Cuban, but here in the U.S. I'm a Latino. So there's that tension between what you are in terms of race in a culture and what you are and how you are defined in terms of race and ethnicity in a different country. That is very that is a stark difference. But going back to the religions, one thing that I do love about this Afro diasporic religions is that once you get into one of these communities, your race really doesn't matter. You are part of the clan. And of course, there might be jokes. Oh, you're a white person doing, brujeria, witchcraft, and as a sort of a joke. But again, it doesn't mean that you are not accepted into that clan. And there's one scholar here in the U.S., Aisha Belizo de Jesus, that actually she argues that regardless of practitioners' race, through initiation, practitioners adopt a Black epistemology. Not necessarily, they are not impersonating a race. They are not Black, right? But they are within that Black epistemology. And I think that's really interesting to conceptualize how many of these religions create their own sort of acceptance and community that's not tied to being Black or being white or being mulatto.
So I want to go back to something else that you talked about in your work, because you come to this, as you have described, through the theater, through other cultural productions. So I say other cultural productions because that's how I view religion. It's something that people do, right? It's a cultural production. But theater and literature are things that people do. And so these things bump up against one another. Can you talk about, I mean, you've mentioned a little bit about the theater here, but can you talk a little bit more about your work and representation of these communities in the arts, and maybe even both representation and misrepresentation, because I've got to think that that's a big part of it as well.
Yeah, the work that I analyze is usually has a sort of representation that is decent. And I prefer to focus on that. There are many examples of misrepresentation of all sorts of Afro-diasporic religions in TV and film and all that, but I try to analyze the sort of representation that allow us not only to see a specific religious practice, but also to think through societal problems and politics and diversity and many different issues. And also that many of these representations allow for more visibility towards wider audiences for these practices. So many of the playwrights that I study, Cuban playwrights, Eugenio Hernandez Espinosa, René Fernández Santana, they try to bring the myths, the origin myths of many of these religions, and tell stories through them, which is something that we have been doing for 2,000 years with Greek myths. And they are now, these pillars of society. But there are so many myths that come from the oral tradition of these religions that people do not know about, and they're really interesting, and they can tell us a lot about human behavior and about who we are as people, as people in a society, in a couple, and they have been using those strategies of telling the myths, Black diasporic religions, in the theater. Also, the music has been present in dance, in theater, and they have great power to convey emotional states, and also there's so much in the rhythm of drums or spiritual songs. There's also another religious trend that I didn't mention before is Spiritism, and which is practiced in the Hispanic Caribbean and in Cuba. And there are many songs that connect us to the dead. And that it's very powerful too, because it allows us to think through the invisible, right? Through what it's beyond our own lives, and how do we interact with this, with presences that were with us and suddenly they are not anymore. Where they went? What happened with that spirituality that person carried with them? So in the theater, we also get to process our grief in some ways, or to imagine new ways of thinking through pain and death.
So when we're thinking about these playwrights that you study, who is the intended audience for these works? Is it meant to translate these, I mean, not literally linguistically, but translate these experiences, this kind of spirituality to an outside audience? Or is it intended to be a mirror to the community that they would recognize? And it's sort of making something, produce something that is out of the raw material of their traditions that they're proud of. Because it seems to me like that affects the production greatly, thinking about, who it's intended for.
Absolutely, and it really depends. I am right now. I'm working on an article on 3 playwrights that depict in different ways the Virgin of Charity, Oshun, in their works. And one production was the playwright is called Alberto Pedro. The play is called Mar Nuestro, Our Sea, though it was translated as with a different title a few years ago here in the U.S. And in that play, for instance, we have 3 women stranded in the middle of the sea. They are trying to escape a country that is not named, but we presume might be Cuba. They might be trying to get to the U.S. But again, it's a situation that could be relatable to many people. And there are many. There's one moment when the Virgin appears and talks to them, and some people that know the story behind the Virgin of Charity and Oshun, they will recognize some signposts that are there to be recognized. But some other people might watch this performance and say, okay, these are 3 women that are lost in the sea and they're trying to figure out what to do, to return, to go ahead, and how to survive with the little food that they have as they take the decision of what to do. There's another play that I study by performance artist and theater maker here in the U.S. Of Cuban origin, but she has been living in the U.S. for most of her life. Carmelita Tropicana, that's her stage name. And there is a moment in which we have an apparition of the Virgin that is actually speaking a sort of Yiddish language. So it's playful, it's campy, it's not going to be interpreted as only one saying from one specific religion. It might be interpreted as a powerful religious personification of some powerful force that is intervening in that specific moment of the action. So and that for me is the beauty of theater, that one thing can be many things for different spectators, and that the way that the playwrights, directors, actors convey that, it's not just to make a point about religion itself, but to use religion as ingrained in society and in the lives of the characters.
So we've been talking a little bit about, on the edges, about the diaspora communities in the U.S. I mean, obviously the Cuban community in South Florida is, the Cuban American community, in South Florida is huge. But that's not the only one, and that's not the only place. And I'm thinking about sort of the public conversation of religious diversity and how these Afro-Caribbean religious traditions enter into it. So, for example, if people know of Santeria at all, they might know it from the Supreme Court case in Hialeah, Florida, for example. Or, I don't know, I mean, from your time in the U.S., how do you see the integration of this rich tapestry of religious traditions that are more and more visible in American life? How do you see that public conversation? Is it different than it was 10 years ago? Where do you see it going? I guess my general question is, how do you see these traditions sort of being integrated or being imagined as a part of the larger religious life of the country?
That's a really interesting question. I lived for a long time in Miami. I've been living here in the Northeast for just my second year. So there's so much that I don't know about the US yet. And I think that even though there's definitely more diversity and more public conversation about diversity. At the same time, I feel that in the last years, there's also a big pushback towards Christianity and certain ideas of, or a more polarized view about what is right and what is wrong. And many of these religions, they have ideas of what is right and what is wrong that they're not just black and white. There are many shades in there. So I'm not sure. I don't know. I am not sure that more and more people will understand what this religion stands for unless there is much more public conversation about what these religions are and what practicants look like, and what's their worldview. There's much ignorance as well about these things, these topics. Yeah, but, and I wanted to touch on this. There are some attempts to give more visibility to these religions and to show what a rich tapestry of diversity do exist already, even if it's not entirely visible from some areas or from certain areas of the political discourse. And this is a book edited this year by Martin Sang. It's called Spirited Diasporas, Personal Narratives and Global Futures of Afro-Atlantic Religions. And it has first-person testimonies of people from all around the world. But here in the US, I was very surprised to know about communities, voodoo communities in Boston, and Regla de Ocho Santeria communities in Chicago, in addition to many other places in the US. And many of the people that do these testimonies are not tied in any way to the geographical region. Say they do not have a Cuban or Haitian heritage. They are Americans, or they are British, or they are from different parts of the world that do not have a personal ethnical or origin to the religion itself, and still they are attracted to them because of their openness, especially in terms of gender and sexuality, and how many of these religions allow for different ways of being, that it's not tied to this heteronormative paradigm of Christianity, for instance. So long answer short, I do think there is hope for a better understanding of these religions, and I think that many of these communities are growing, but at the same time we need to do more.
Yeah. So something that you and I in the past have talked about, and I'm going to do a little commercial here, because we do on campus, this is of course our podcast, and we do on campus the Worldviews program, which invites people to come and talk about their own religious experiences to enhance literacy of our own community. And if you're out there and you're within shouting distance of the Lehigh Valley and you want to come and talk about Santeria or Ochun or any of these particular, or I'm always looking for a Rastafarian to come on, or somebody from those Haitian traditions, whatever. I absolutely agree. Like, this is something that exists in the Lehigh Valley, but it's hard for somebody like me to tap into those communities and find people who are, trusting enough, right, to have their worldview sort of examined and considered. But I think it's good for everybody. It's good for the community so that we have a better level of acceptance, and it's good for us because I think we need to understand our world better. So reach out to us at our web address. You can go to religionandculture.com and find the information where you can reach out, and we can see if we can get you on Worldviews. So the question I always like to finish up with is, I always try to be really aware of my own myopia, that I come up with topics that I want us to talk about, but I'm always really aware that there might be something that I'm just not talking about that you would leave today and you would say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that he didn't ask about X, right? So what is the thing that we're not talking about that you think, our listeners really need to know about when confronting this topic, when thinking about these Afro-Caribbean traditions?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think one, I've offered 2 times a class on these topics, and the first time I titled it Brujeria, It's Not Witchcraft. And here for, because the amount of characters were too long, we just skipped it to Brujeria in Latin American cultures. There's this, and perhaps because of the depiction of many of these religions or the misrepresentations of these religions in the media, there tends to be this notion that they are equal to witchcraft, and that there's some sort of evil related to these practices. And in that class, I have tied the witchcraft processes that many women were subjected to through the Inquisition to this Afro-diasporic practices, and how many times they have been misinterpreted, misrepresented, and tied to ideas of obscurantism and the devil, and that has nothing to do with these religions. They are religions that center in the well-being of people. They care about health. They care about love, and they have a great wisdom that has been passed from generations to generations through oral stories. And those are beautiful, beautiful stories that that hopefully more people would get interested in. So don't be afraid to ask questions about these religions. The people that practice them are people like you and me, and they just want a better life for themselves and for their communities.
All right. Well, I think that's a great place to stop. So, Lilianne Lugo Herrera, thank you so much for being on ReligionWise.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Chip.
This has been ReligionWise, a podcast produced by the Institute for Religious and Cultural Understanding of Muhlenberg College. ReligionWise is produced and directed by Christine Flicker. For more information about additional programming, or to make an inquiry about a speaking engagement, please visit our website at religionandculture.com. There, you'll find our contact information, links to other programming, and have the opportunity to support the work of the Institute. Please subscribe to ReligionWise wherever you get your podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time.